So on February 2nd, 2026, a manifesto dropped that, well, it basically attempts to do the impossible.
Oh, completely impossible. Or at least it sounds that way at first.
Right. It outlines this incredibly detailed plan to permanently fire the developers of Bitcoin.
Just completely remove them from the equation.
Exactly. And to strip all the power from those massive mining farms and basically replace all of that dynamic billion-dollar infrastructure with, get this, a single unchangeable JPEG image.
It is wild.
It's insane. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a radical, completely uncompromising document today called the Genesis Act, a declaration of Bitcoin settlement finality.
Yeah, and it is a profound text. I mean,
Right.
what the author puts forward here challenges the very foundation of how we, understand decentralized technology.
Absolutely.
Because what's fascinating here is that the central premise argues that Bitcoin does not exist because of its elegant code or, its brilliant cryptography or even the developers who maintain it.
None of that matters, according to this.
Right. It exists as money strictly through the voluntary, continuous choice of the users. Full stop.
Just the users.
Yeah. And because of that, the author believes we've reached this critical tipping point. Like, the rules of the network must be permanently locked in stone right now before governance drift fundamentally destroys the system from the inside out.
Which is a terrifying thought. But okay, we should probably establish exactly who wrote this thing, because if you just glance at the title page, you might honestly think it's a joke.
Oh, for sure. The names are ridiculous.
Yeah, the author uses this string of internet pseudonyms. We're talking ugly old goat, totally depraved boomer, and up-return moron.
Which is such a specific inside joke for the crypto crowd.
Right. And for anyone listening who might not follow the deep, technical weeds of the network, that last one refers to the op-return function, which is basically a way to embed arbitrary non-financial data into the blockchain.
Like putting a picture of a cat on a global financial ledger.
Exactly. The author uses it ironically to mock people who clutter the network with useless data. But, despite these super colorful names, the text itself is written with the gravity of a constitutional charter.
It really is. The tone is dead serious.
It's like a master plan. I sort of picture Bitcoin right now as this bustling city with absolutely no zoning laws. People are just building whatever, wherever.
Just total chaos.
Right, total chaos. And the Genesis Act is basically the ultimate unchangeable master plan being slammed down on the mayor's desk, like a dead serious legal and philosophical framework for the future of digital money.
The contrast is just striking between those internet culture pseudonyms and the sheer, legal weight of the prose. But to understand why this Genesis Act emerged when it did, like in early 2026, we have to look back at a very specific historical catalyst.
The incident in 2025.
Exactly. Article F-Lie of the document points directly to this event that took place in October 2025. It describes a moment where the core developers of the Bitcoin software initiated what they called an unintentional shift in defaults.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you are running a global decentralized network, a shift in defaults isn't just a minor, bug fix.
No, it's massive.
When the maintainers of the core software push an update that changes default behaviors, and a majority of node operators around the world simply download and run that update without heavily auditing the code.
Which most of them don't do, they just update.
Right. That change instantly propagates across the entire globe. It fundamentally alters how the network operates, completely bypassing any formal debate. And according to the text, this silent change exposed a huge structural flaw in how Bitcoin is governed.
That is the absolute crux of the issue right there. The October 2025 event basically demonstrated that the unwritten rules, the informal social contracts holding the community together, they just weren't enough.
They were too fragile.
Yeah. Because when boundaries aren't strictly documented in human language, assumptions take over. And assumptions in a complex, distributed system, they eventually lead to unintended consequences.
But wait, if an inner circle of developers pushed a change that completely bypassed the users and almost caused a crisis, doesn't the author frame that as a betrayal?
You would think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, if the whole premise of this document is that users must be in total control, an invisible default shift by a few coders seems like the ultimate power grab.
You would logically assume the author would just treat the developers as the villains here. But the text actually takes a highly nuanced, almost sociological view of the situation.
Really?
Yeah. Ugly Old Goat explicitly states that Bitcoin Core did not betray the network. In fact, the document goes out of its way to praise them.
Oh, wow. So they aren't the bad guys.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that for over a decade, these specific developers secured the protocol through multiple existential crises. They navigated incredibly hostile environments with intense discipline.
So they're just, what, a product of a flawed governance structure?
Precisely. The author argues that what happened was simply a manifestation of human nature operating within an undefined space. Governance drift is just the natural gravity of any system that lacks explicit, codified boundaries.
Makes sense.
There's actually a specific line in the text that anchors this entire philosophy, and it's brilliant. Quote, "Failure is not betrayal. Failure is revelation."
Wow, failure is revelation. That reframes the entire October 2025 event. It wasn't an attack from the inside, it was just a stress test that the system organically failed.
Exactly. By accidentally exposing this vulnerability, the developers basically performed a final, crucial service to the network. They revealed the exact defect.
Which is the lack of explicit user consent mechanisms.
Right, and that is exactly what the Genesis Act is now attempting to repair. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that unwritten social consensus is no longer strong enough to protect a global monetary asset.
So if failure is just a revelation of bad governance, then the next logical step isn't to punish the developers, it's to strip them of the power to make those invisible changes entirely.
Yeah, you have to take the power away.
But how does the author actually propose doing that? Because usually in tech, the coders are the gods of their universe, right?
Oh, absolutely. Code is law.
If they write it, it becomes reality. But Article V of this document completely flips that Silicon Valley ethos on its head. It outlines this immutable enforcement hierarchy that actively demotes the people writing the code.
It is a direct assault on that code is law concept that has dominated the crypto space for years. The Genesis Act establishes a strict one-way flow of authority.
And what's at the top?
At the absolute top of this hierarchy is something developers usually despise: human language.
Wait, really? Just prose?
Just prose. Step 1 is defined in prose. Step 2, users grant legitimacy to that prose. Step 3, nodes enforce the legitimacy. Step 4, miners comply with it. And at the very bottom, step 5, developers codify it.
Okay, I have to stop you there. How does a user reading a PDF actually force a miner who is running a $100 million server farm to obey?
It sounds impossible.
Right. In the real world, the miner has all the hash power. They generate the actual security for the network. And the developer writes the software the miner runs. How does human prose dictate terms to machines and the billionaires who own them?
It comes down to pure, brutal economics. The hierarchy isn't relying on goodwill. It relies entirely on game theory.
Okay, walk me through that.
Think of it like a constitutional republic. The users are the voting public, right? They determine what actually has value. The nodes, which are the individual computers verifying transactions, they're like the courts. They strictly enforce the law.
Right, checking every transaction.
Exactly. And the miners are the executive branch, doing the heavy lifting to process everything. But miners burn enormous amounts of real-world electricity. They only do that because they expect to be paid in a currency that has value.
Ah, the block reward. They need the Bitcoin they mine to actually be worth something.
Bingo. If a miner decides to run code that violates the pros, say, want to change the inflation schedule or censor transactions, the network of user-run nodes will simply reject their blocks.
So the miner just burned millions of dollars in electricity and gets absolutely nothing in return.
Nothing. Zero. Therefore, the miners must comply with the nodes. And the nodes only run software that aligns with what the users consider legitimate. And the users base their legitimacy on the stated pros.
So the code is utterly powerless without economic consensus backing it.
Powerless.
Mm.
The miners and developers are effectively just clerks and laborers serving the economic will of the users.
That is wild. The Genesis Act basically exists to make sure they never forget their place at the bottom of that hierarchy.
Exactly.
So if users and their pros are the ultimate authority, what exact rules are they cementing into this master plan? Because looking at Articles 1, 2, and 3, the boundaries are shockingly rigid.
Oh, they leave zero room for interpretation. None.
Yeah, Article 1 establishes the absolute core mandate. Bitcoin's base layer exists solely for monetary settlement. Like, its only valid functions are transferring value, settling obligations, and preserving monetary integrity over time.
Right. And the document explicitly states that no other purpose is primary. and no secondary purpose may ever override this function.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
If we look at the history of digital networks, survival is entirely based on innovation. I mean, the internet evolved from static text pages to streaming 4K video.
That's constantly adapted. Yeah.
Exactly. So what if a massive technological breakthrough occurs? What if someone discovers a highly efficient way to route secure, decentralized communications through the base layer? That could bring in 1 billion new users and drive massive demand for block space.
It sounds great on paper.
Right. A rational system should adapt to capture that value. Why would you deliberately hamstring the network's ability to innovate like that?
Well, under the framework of the Genesis Act, you would reject that innovation immediately.
Immediately, just like that.
Yep. Article 3 permanently excludes all non-monetary data from the settlement layer. And the language here is absolute. It declares the exclusion is, quote, categorical, irreversible, and not subject to future reconsideration.
Not subject to reconsideration. Wow.
It specifically notes that no argument of efficiency, innovation, convenience, or network demand shall ever override this rule. If it is not pure monetary settlement, it is banned from the base layer forever.
That level of intentional rigidity seems incredibly dangerous. I mean, if the technological landscape shifts radically in 50 years and the base layer refuses to adapt, doesn't it just die? Why choose absolute inflexibility over evolution?
Because the author makes a fundamental distinction between the nature of technology and the nature of money.
Okay, what's the difference?
Technology requires disruption and constant evolution to survive. Money requires the exact opposite.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Article 9X dives deeply into the concept of monetary confidence. The text makes this profound observation. Monetary system does not fail when its rules change. It fails when the users believe the rules will never stop changing.
That implies adaptability is actually a bug, not a feature when it comes to settlement layers.
Precisely. If the base layer can be constantly tweaked or, upgraded or optimized for the sake of convenience or some brilliant new use case, then it is vulnerable to political capture.
Because everyone will want their feature added.
Exactly. It becomes an ongoing software experiment where factions will constantly fight to implement their preferred features. You cannot build a global, multi-generational economy on a foundation that might shift its parameters next Tuesday because a group of developers found a new efficiency.
So to be true money, the foundation has to stop shifting entirely.
Right. The author argues that the rules might be imperfect, but their perfection matters far less than their permanence.
Okay, so we have this philosophical framework where human language dictates the rules, and the rules demand absolute, unyielding monetary purity. But a major practical hurdle remains.
Getting it onto the network.
Exactly. You can't just upload a PDF legal document to a decentralized network of computers and expect them to enforce it. The text has to be translated into technical reality. How does the Genesis Act propose locking this in mechanically?
That is addressed in the sections concerning finality and memorialization. The document outlines two distinct phases for the network: formation and finality.
And right now we're in the formation phase, right?
Yes. Currently, we are in the formation phase. This is characterized by open discourse, debate, and basically the discovery of clarity among the users. It's the messy process of figuring out what the consensus actually is.
The text notes that this formation phase is not actual governance. It's just the chaotic prelude to it.
Right. But once that clarity is found, and the text is fully ratified by the users, meaning no competing definition holds any meaningful economic weight, the network enters finality.
And what happens in finality?
Well, Article 6 is very clear about what happens next. Once in finality, the constraints only move in one direction.
Meaning they can only get stricter.
Exactly. Future updates can clarify the rules, simplify the code, or enforce the constraints more strictly. But you can never relax, reverse, or renegotiate them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How do they prove that finality has been reached and the debate is permanently over? The author introduces the concept of the final JPEG.
It is such a brilliant fusion of social consensus and cryptographic permanence.
So basically, once this prose document, the Genesis Act, is completely finished, debated, and ratified by the economic majority of users, the text itself is rendered into a single image file, a literal JPEG.
Just a picture of the words.
Yeah. And then, using a technical upgrade process known as a soft fork, that specific image file is permanently anchored into the Bitcoin blockchain. It becomes this unchangeable artifact etched into the digital stone of every node on the planet.
We should probably clarify the mechanics of a soft fork here because it's critical to how this is actually enforced.
Yeah, please do.
A soft fork is a backward-compatible upgrade. It doesn't expand the rules, it tightens them. So nodes that upgrade to the new rules will reject blocks that violate them, but older nodes will still see the new blocks as valid. It's
What is settled now is memorialized forever. That line captures the sheer finality of the act. For anyone who has spent years watching digital networks operate, watching the endless debates on forums, the civil wars over block sizes, the constant lobbying for new features,
the drama is endless.
it really is. The psychological shift here is massive. The Genesis Act drops a heavy binder on the table and basically declares, put your pencils down, the test is over, we are no longer building, we are settling.
It forces a transition, right? From an iterative software project into a finalized monetary protocol.
The software project is done.
Yeah. Now, the document isn't against innovation entirely. The closing declaration explicitly states that experimentation, debate, and complex new features can and should continue, but they must happen elsewhere.
On secondary layers.
Exactly. On secondary layers built on top of the network or on entirely different systems. The base layer is off limits, the foundation is poured, and the concrete is dry.
The software must ossify, so the money can solidify. We've traced the origins of this document from the October 2025 default shift that proved unwritten rules will inevitably fail.
And we've explored that radical inversion of power, too. The one that places human pros and user consensus firmly above developers and mining farms.
Absolutely. And we've detailed the final JPEG mechanism, using a soft fork to cryptographically lock the era of tinkering firmly in the past.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for you listening right now, the Genesis Act forces every participant in the network to confront a definitive choice.
What's choice?
Do you want continuous evolution, accepting the inherent risks of governance drift, political capture, and endless debate? Or do you want absolute, unyielding finality, accepting that you can never go back and modify the foundation, regardless of what the future holds?
It is an incredible wager on the nature of resilience. I mean, in the natural world, the species that survives an ever-changing environment is the one most capable of adaptation. Total rigidity usually leads to extinction.
Usually, yeah.
But the Genesis Act bets that digital money operates under entirely different laws of physics. So if this manifesto succeeds and a global decentralized system successfully stops all future evolution at the base layer, basically becoming a perfectly static system locked in cryptographic amber.
Does that perfect immutability guarantee its survival for eternity by preventing corruption?
Or does the absolute inability to adapt eventually become its fatal vulnerability when the technological world around it inevitably transforms? Something to chew on.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.